The primary ends of education has to focus on the idea that a person has a soul, that there are certain things that our souls need perennially.
Caylan Ford is the founder of Calgary Classical Academy, a tuition-free public charter school where a very different vision of education is taking shape.
So education in this sense is about turning around the soul so that it's oriented toward things that are actually eternally true and good and enduring.
That vision is brought to life through a classical liberal arts education, one that draws on history, philosophy, and great books. Students aren't just learning facts, they're learning to think, question, and understand the world, while being immersed in arts, music, and craftsmanship that shape both intellect and character.
What does virtue mean to you?
That's a good question.
Training in moral and intellectual discernment to allow someone to more readily and accurately judge between virtue and vice, justice and injustice, beauty and baseness. We grew from just under 300 students and a little more than a dozen faculty. We now have 1,500 students in 3 campuses with close to 100 teachers.
A sign that many are searching for something more, an education that speaks not just to the mind, but also to the soul.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. That's it. Not crushed. What does virtue mean to you?
Virtue means to me the pursuance of the good. So here we learn about the transcendentals, which are the true, the good, and the beautiful. So when you pursue virtue, you pursue those things.
Virtue is how you act. If you have if you have a specific virtue like benevolence, you show it in how you act and how you speak to people. It's the opposite of a vice, and a vice is like a detrimental property, and virtue is good.
Well, in this school we do Latin, but in my old school we did not have Latin. In fact, we didn't even have orchestra, any instrument playing, just the bare minimum of what they had need. This school is way different because they use their budget good and uses it for libraries, as you can see, classroom decoration, textbooks, and they're just really good quality, and I really admire that.
What's the best thing about this place?
I think it is the community that we've cultivated here. My vice principal, Mr. Hertzsprung, has said it in this way, which I love the way that he put it. He said, when you look in the playground, there's no child that's alone. There's no child that's playing alone. And I think that's a really beautiful and important factor of a school, the community and the companionship.
I do have a lot of friends. That's one of the big factors.
What, in your understanding, makes classical education distinct?
Well, we do learn more Latin, and it's more organized than a public school.
This school is way different because they actually care, will actually spend time with you, sacrificing their breaks. Math here is way more advanced. I feel like science here is also way better.
Yes, they're realizing that the world needs periods of sleep and of vitality, and that the sleep is a necessary part.
Oh, awesome.
Much like civilizations need.
Caylan Ford, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Well, thank you for having me on.
You have a unique way of approaching education. And so in your view, what is the real problem with education as it exists today?
I think the problem with education as it exists today begins with first principles. People have lost sight of what education is supposed to be for because they've lost sight of what a human being is for. So I think if you were to survey most educators today or policymakers in this realm of education and ask them what the purpose of schooling is, they would probably give you an answer like, well, it's to prepare people for the workforce. Or if they have maybe a more sort of activist bent, they might say it's to educate children to be sort of agents of change who will transform society in some direction or other that they consider favorable. And our view is that human beings don't exist merely to be future workers. That's kind of a happy side effect if you can contribute to your society in a productive way. But the primary ends of education has to focus on the idea that a person has a soul, that there are certain things that our souls need perennially. And I think it needs to answer to those sort of essential needs of the human soul.
When I think of classical education, I think about educating people to be virtuous and to understand beauty. And so, but you're talking about something even a little deeper than that.
There's a definition of education from Dr. Johnson's dictionary, right? The first real comprehensive English dictionary, where it's described as something like formation in manners and habits. And then he draws a reference to Richard Hooker's work, who talks about the idea of education as training in moral and intellectual discernment to allow someone to more readily and accurately judge between virtue and vice, justice and injustice, beauty and baseness. So I think there's this element of fostering those faculties of discernment. That's a big part of it. But if we look at the root of the term to educate, it comes from the Latin educere, which means to extract or to draw out. Which of course raises the question, to draw out of what? And the image that for me comes to mind is going back to the original academy, Plato's Grove in Academe, where he talked about, he elaborated the allegory of the cave. And in this allegory, you picture human beings as prisoners inside a cave. Their necks and their limbs are bound to a wall, and so that they can face only one direction. So they're looking at a wall of the cave, and they're sitting in front of a wall to which they're bound. Behind that wall is a perpetually blazing fire. And then someone is passing artifacts above the wall to cast shadows. So the prisoners are basically looking at this play of shadows that's being cast on the wall. So, puppets and figurines and they mistake these projections for reality, but they don't realize that this is actually just a sort of faint shadow or simulacrum. And so in Plato's telling, then, one day you imagine that one of these people is forcibly unshackled, made to stand up and to turn around. And so for the first time, they actually see the fire that is creating these shadows. And this burns the eyes, right? If you're accustomed to darkness, when you start to see something that is closer to truth, it can feel uncomfortable at first. And then they're pulled forcibly out of the mouth of the cave and into the sun, which is, in this metaphor, it represents the agathon, the ultimate good, the source of things in creation. And this is even more painful, of course. But through this process, the person comes to realize that they have encountered reality. It's this, what Henri Bergson calls the opening of the soul. So you're actually, it's this sort of almost sublime, almost ecstatic encounter with reality as it truly is. Now, if that person were to go back down into the cave and try to enjoin their fellows to come out of the cave, to unshackle themselves, in all likelihood, most people are going to disbelieve them. He'll be laughed at. He'll probably be persecuted. So if this person goes back down into the cave and tries to free their fellow prisoners, most likely he'll be set upon and persecuted and torn to pieces. But in Plato's telling, a person still has a kind of obligation to go back down into the cave and to try to raise people up and to turn them around. So education in this sense is about turning around the soul so that it's oriented toward things that are actually eternally true and good and enduring, and to draw them out of the cave into the light of reality. So that to me is what education is really about, is it evokes this image of pulling people out of the shackles of ignorance, but also turning their souls toward what is actually eternally true and good for them.
What you described earlier makes me think about something that I've just been coming up against in this show regularly, and it's just how our society has really turned towards utilitarianism in all sorts of forms. And because what you're talking about is, again, sort of a realm that I think a lot of people just don't simply think about today, never mind about educating their kids.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I think this is one of the consequences of when we push questions of ultimate concern, questions that engender like metaphysical questions or questions about, what is life for? Why do we come here? Where do we go after death? These are kind of, to me, the ultimate questions. And if we don't have answers to those, I don't know, for me, everything else sort of starts to seem a little meaningless, but we've relegated those questions to the margins of our consciousness and are very fixated on the material, on the things that can be kind of empirically demonstrated, sensed through the sensory organs, held and possessed. But ultimately, those things are all fleeting. And so what are we really left with when those things go away?
Well, the complication that I think a number of people might respond with, right, to what you just said is that, yeah, but there's all sorts of different models of how that works, and how do we decide, and why should one model dominate another, and are they even true in the first place? How do we know that?
That's a great question. So I turn back to the etymology of the word philosophy. Right? So philosophy means it's love of wisdom. It's not a claim to possess wisdom, right? It's not perfect knowledge of everything that is true, of everything that is kind of transcendently real. It's an orientation toward it. So it's a loving orientation of the soul to try to seek what is true and good, recognizing, the limits of human wisdom. We have pretty stark cognitive limitations. So we'll never have perfect knowledge of these things. We have to be humble in our approach to it. But the inability to perfectly grasp these concepts at every level of manifestation isn't reason to sort of throw up your arms and say, well, we shouldn't try then, right? If we accept the premise that claims about what is true or just or beautiful are all merely fungible, and that these are totally subjective, right? If you have your truth, I have my truth, what's beautiful to me is ugly to you, I don't think it's possible to share a society. There are, of course, there's a huge array of differences between people, but I think on these kind of fundamental things, we probably do agree, even across cultures, across faith traditions, on a lot of the really fundamental questions. But if we say that these things aren't real, then we lose the collective criteria by which we can actually adjudicate moral disputes. So, typically if two people disagree about something, we might, though we disagree, say that, well, we both want what's true. And then we can compare our ideas, then we can debate, we can engage in dialogue, and we can try to approach the truth more closely. But if you say there's no such thing as truth, or I disagree fundamentally about the value of truth, then there is no process by which we can adjudicate those disputes. We're basically just left with power, with violence. And I think you get a lot of sort of civilizational fraying at that point. Mm-hmm. So we need some kind of common moral vocabulary. We need some set standards against which human beings can judge their own actions, against which we can judge, the acts of government, whether it's just or unjust. So without those transcendent standards, all you're left with is power. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's a world that anyone wants to inhabit.
Well, and apparently a lot of people who have kids agree with you, as this, you have this giant waiting list of people that want to come to your school. Caylan, we're going to continue the discussion in just a moment after a short break. Before we dive into, how does this look practically? There's a few of these types of lessons that a very young child could learn easily with, even kind of with building blocks or something like this.
Absolutely.
Right?
You're totally right. And I attribute that in part to the fact that most students never study history in a coherent or sequential way. So here in Alberta, history is not part of the mandatory curriculum. You get little smatterings of it here and there. It's never systematic. There's no coherent narrative. It's often kind of a theme or a sort of thematic lens through which you might view a couple episodes in history. But if you want to inculcate a sense of gratitude, I think it really helps if you take students through the process of how are early civilizations formed? What's the transition from a nomadic society to a sedentary to a civilized society? What is a civilizational golden age? What are the qualities that characterize it? How do you get there? By studying this systematically, as our students do, you start to understand that actually wresting order from chaos is really, really hard. That peace and prosperity and freedom are not the default conditions of human civilizations or of human societies throughout history. And so to the extent that we enjoy those, they're very, very hard won. We try to teach our students too that it's much easier to destroy something than it is to build. Building a prosperous civilization, one that's flourishing in arts, in learning, and culture, is a task of hundreds, if not thousands, of years. So by taking them through this history cycle, by having them inhabit the minds of people in different periods in history, so our students read a lot of primary source material. They're not judging the past through current prejudices. They're trying to understand it on its own terms. And by helping them understand that even our scientific developments were arrived at through an iterative process spanning many, many generations. I think this all inculcates intellectual habits of gratitude, of humility, and it inclines us more to be a little bit more deferential toward what we've inherited. Not blindly deferential, but a little bit more inclined to say, all right, we've inherited something precious. We haven't really had classical education for a couple generations now. So most of our teachers were not educated in this way. They were educated in something that's more closely resembles the kind of modern or progressive model. So it's an interesting process of trying to reach back and rediscover this tradition. And the way we do that is, well, this is a tradition that is very, very heavily documented. So, our teachers will do book studies. In our first year, we studied Aristotle's Ethics together. And then the next year, we read the Republic together. And this year, kind of working our way through canonical texts from classical antiquity and the pre-Socratics through to scholastics of the Middle Ages up to modern times, with some Confucian educational tradition thrown in there as well. So it's an ongoing process of trying to recover that tradition, even among those of us who didn't directly inherit it ourselves.
So who are these teachers?
Well, so when I first applied to open a charter school in Alberta in 2021, and it was finally approved in January 2022. And then it was kind of a rushed process to try to figure out, well, what's our building going to be? We have to put together a board of directors, develop a curriculum, put policy together, enroll hundreds of students, and hire, I think in our first year, it was about 15, 16 teachers. And I was really worried initially that we wouldn't find the teachers who could actually teach this program. So, we're looking for people with deep content knowledge who view themselves as subject matter experts, for people with certain pedagogical training. That's the opposite of the progressive kind of pedagogical fads and going back to things that actually work, but also people with the right philosophical disposition, that they're interested and want to pursue a very different kind of project. So I was really worried about this in our first year, and yet there they were. It was people who in many cases had been in other public schools, kind of keeping their heads down. People who had often been passed up for promotion opportunities because they didn't toe the line ideologically, but were actually incredibly competent teachers and, as we discovered, administrators. We grew from, in our first year, we were kindergarten to grade 6 with about just under 300 students and a little more than a dozen faculty. We now have over 100 school-based staff. We're just entering our 4th year. We have 1,500 students in 3 campuses, with over 100 or close to 100 teachers. This is our front office here. And then this here is our grade 5 corridor. The grade 5s study ancient history from ancient Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Indus River civilizations, but then they progress up through the fall of Rome. So we thought we would theme this
so
hallway.
what happened in that building?
Yes. Oh, the gladiators is a popular topic. So this is one example. So as I mentioned, we try to include some art that is representative of different cultures, different faith traditions, but all of which are kind of orient students towards something that's beautiful and transcendent. So this is a classical Chinese painting, and it's the descent of various bodhisattvas from the heavens. This is our east entrance. So we have a ceiling panel from a Buddhist temple in Beijing, a Ming era Buddhist temple. Well, so this is Jacques-Louis David was unfortunately kind of the artist of the French Revolution, but I'm not going to hold that against him because he was also a great neoclassicist. So this is depicting Socrates' speech just as he's about to drink the hemlock as described in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. So he's expounding on what happens to the soul after death, and his friends are around him weeping, and he's basically trying to console them, saying, "Why are you fearing for me? You know, the soul doesn't just descend into Hades. My soul is, you know, I've cultivated myself such that my soul is pure and unalloyed, and so on my death I will return and kind of unify with those qualities in the heavens."
The Acropolis.
Ah, yes. This is the Acropolis. But here, I'm going to show you my favorites.
Okay.
There's two that are my favorites. So this is the School of Athens. So one of the so Raphael painted himself. This is Raphael staring at you. And then he painted these figures. So this is Aristotle, who's pointing to the earth because his philosophy concerns things that are kind of practical in a sense, whereas Plato is pointing up toward the heavens, toward the eternal. And then this is Socrates in dialogue, maybe with Alexander the Great, maybe with Alcibiades. This is a painting full of anachronisms. But one of the fun things is that Raphael modeled them on his friends. So he made Plato in the image of Leonardo da Vinci and Heraclitus in the image of Michelangelo, I think, and then Diogenes sprawling on the steps, and the mathematicians calculating the spheres and things. That's one of my other favorites. This is a fresco. It's in actually quite a small city or town in Italy, whose name I forget. And it was done by a student of Raphael's. And this is a ceiling fresco, and it kind of descends down the walls. And this is the Fall of the Giants. Many of our faculty, we hire them initially as tutors, but they have doctorates. And then we get this letter for them from the minister so that they can be full teachers after we've kind of made sure that they're cool. Dr. Donner's very cool.
So this has been just an amazing, truly amazing experience, actually. I can't wait to see, you know, it'll take a few years, but I can't wait to see what happens with these kids.
I look forward to it too, yeah.
No, thank you so much.
It was wonderful. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you.